Most of what we know about Tasmanian convict history comes from the Tasmanian Convict Archive. But historians' relationship with the archive has historically not been great. Between 1803 and 1853, around 73,000 men, women and children were transported to Van Diemen's Land as convicts. These convicts were documented in minute detail. All right, listen up everybody. I want detailed physical descriptions. Where they're from, what skills they have, where they're sent in the colony. Work done, punishment borne, marriages sought, babies born. Go. The level of detail in the archives is quite incredible. Thank you. But cut to the end of transportation to Van Diemen's Land in 1853, and suddenly everyone's become really awkward about living in a colony founded by criminals. So the convict archives were literally locked away. In many cases they were actively destroyed. And in an attempt to wash away the convict stain, people employed that foolproof technique used since the dawn of time. If we don't talk about it, no one will know what happened. This does not work. Because they didn't have access to the actual convict archives, most early historians didn't really know what they were talking about. Every now and then you'll read a coy reference to unpaid labour or some prisoners, but it was only in an absolute true blue historical emergency that they'd actually mention the convicts. Don't talk about them. This is also because at the time, historians really didn't think convicts were worth writing about. Same goes for women, ethnic minorities, Indigenous Australians. No, what? No, poor people. They're not even there. It took over 100 years for the Tasmanian Convict Archives to open. But in that time, history underwent a bit of an attitude change. In the early 20th century, we had 2 world wars, Russian Revolution, women's suffrage. What? Historians couldn't afford to just keep looking at the great white wealthy men of history. Male, pale and stale. Is that meant to be me? Instead they started looking at these wider groups. We also see a change in the types of people who can become historians during this period, with a greater diversity of people being given access to university education. Also, in the late 20th century, postmodernism happened. What? There can be no definitive history, but only ever multiple histories from different perspectives received in different ways. I literally have no idea what you just said. Basically, different people see the same thing profoundly differently. I mean, it seems obvious now, but back then we used to say, this is what happened and these are facts. But now we say, this is one version of what might have happened based on one interpretation of the sources. So after all of this, by the 1970s, after some really hard campaigning by historians and archivists, the Tasmanian Convict Archive was finally reopened. Suddenly, historians had all of this new information, thanks to the detailed record-keeping practices of the colonial administrators. Yeah, now you thank us. But because of how much society had changed, they also had new ways of looking at the convicts. Instead of just writing off convicts as criminals, they studied convicts as workers who brought a range of skill sets to Australia, as women who weren't all prostitutes. I'll pull the other one. And if they were, they had very good socio-economic reasons for it. Convicts who came from a range of ethnic backgrounds, who weren't all white and didn't all speak English. Convicts who weren't all career criminals. Many of them were first-time offenders or were transported for theft driven by poverty. My convict ancestor only stole a loaf of bread. Yeah, right. One. So today, instead of being embarrassed by our convict ancestors, we're pretty proud of them because it feels like these convicts made it through a really tough and harsh system. But what if that tough, harsh system wasn't the only story? What if we looked at the long-term effects on health or well-being that came from the convict system? What if economic factors affected how a convict was treated? What if I stop asking these rhetorical questions and actually talk about some of the new research I've found? I'd like that. This is where it gets really exciting. Computers! Oh.